Eternal Champions. If I say that name to most fighting game fans, they'll either groan or ask, "You mean that Fishman game?" And honestly, I get it. On the surface, it looks like Sega's awkward attempt to copy Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat at the same time. But under the clunky animation and those bizarre overkills, there's a fighting game that was more ambitious, more original, and more interesting than almost anything else on the Genesis. And by the end of this video, I'm going to show you exactly why Eternal Champions wasn't a failure. It was just fighting a battle it could never really win, and yet somehow still managed to create a pretty unique experience that's a must for any retro gamer. So stick around, because the real story behind this game is way weirder and cooler than you might remember. Let me take you back to 1993. The year this game was released was also the year the UFC first exploded onto the scene, and Street Fighter II had already set the bar for what fighting games could be, and Mortal Kombat had just proven that controversy sold. And now, everyone was talking about real-life martial arts matchups, wondering how different styles would stack up in an actual fight. And right in the middle of all that buzz, here comes Eternal Champions riding the wave. I mean, there wasn't any other fighting game at the time that actually bothered to distinguish between Kempo and Capoeira, between ninjutsu and savate. That felt incredibly timely and authentic. It's like the developers were paying attention to the same conversations that we were all having back then. Every publisher was scrambling to get their own Mortal Kombat clone on the store shelves, including Sega in this case. But here's what makes Eternal Champions different right out of the gate. It wasn't an arcade port. Most fighting games of that era started in the arcades and got squeezed onto home consoles with all kinds of compromises. Eternal Champions was built from the ground up for the Genesis. That meant Sega's team could design it for the hardware instead of fighting against it. And that team was Sega of America's interactive development division, and was an American-made fighting game at the time when Japanese developers dominated the genre. The lead designer, Michael Latham, had actually made a fighting game called Tongue of the Fat Man before Street Fighter even came out, so this wasn't some random team that was thrown together. These guys knew fighting games. The credits list over 60 testers alone, which tells you how much attention they were paying to balance and polish. But sadly, Michael Latham passed away back in 2021, so we'll never get another version of this game made by the original crew. Interestingly, however, the original concept for Eternal Champions was actually supposed to be way more humorous and over the top, with characters that were parodies of heroic archetypes. But somewhere along the way, the tone shifted into something darker and more serious, and the manual opens with this incredible monologue from the Eternal Champion himself, welcoming you to his vast fighting complex that exists in a place and time corrupted by centuries of misuse and destruction. That's not exactly the tone of a Street Fighter clone. So let's be real for a second. Fighting game stories in the 90s were basically an afterthought. You got a paragraph in the manual if you were lucky. But Eternal Champions put a lot of effort into this narrative. The Eternal Champion himself, the cosmic being who maintains the balance between good and evil, has watched 9 individuals die before their time. These weren't random people. They're warriors from different eras who were destined to change the world for some way in the better. He spent centuries harnessing the power of all the great martial arts masters who lived before him, and even with all that collective strength, he can only bring one of them back. So instead of just picking, he makes them all fight in a tournament. The winner gets to return to life a few seconds before their death, with the knowledge to change their fate. Everyone else just dies again. That's brutal. That's also way more thought than many other fighting games of the era put into its story. And the characters' backgrounds are genuinely interesting. Take Blade, the cyborg cop from New Chicago. He was a bounty hunter who got caught in a shootout with a rogue scientist holding a virus that could kill 95% of Earth's population. Or Shadow, the corporate assassin who worked for the Black Orchid Corporation, who died in 1993 when the company arranged for her to fall from the 101st floor of their headquarters after she refused to keep killing for them. Each fighter has their own historical context and tragic death. So, that was the story. Now, let's talk about what made Eternal Champions gameplay stand out. The control scheme followed the same type of 6-button layout that Street Fighter II popularized, with 3 punches and 3 kicks mapped to the 6-button controller. But here's the thing. The standard Genesis controller only had 3 buttons. So, unless you had the 6-button arcade pad or the awesome Sega Activator, you had to press the start button to toggle between punch and kick sets. And the manual literally recommends a 6-button controller for the best experience, which tells you right there that they knew this was a limitation. That was a huge barrier for casual players, and honestly, it's one of the reasons the game got a bad reputation. But the actual fighting system? That's where they got really clever. Most fighting games back then let you spam special moves endlessly. Hadoukens all day, every day. Eternal Champions said no to that. Every special move cost inner strength, represented by that little yin-yang orb next to your health bar. When the orb is full, your powers are at their highest, but each attack consumes some strength. You can only pull off 2 or 3 special moves before you need to wait for it to regenerate. The orb even flashes when your strength is completely used up and you have to rely on basic kicks and punches while it slowly refills. That meant you couldn't just cheese your way through matches with cheap tactics. Eternal Champions actually introduced mechanics that were ahead of its time. Projectiles that could be reflected back at your opponent. Force fields that could block attacks. Characters that actually carried weapons. These weren't only cosmetic differences, they fundamentally changed how you approached each match. The training mode deserves special mention too. There are 3 different training options. There's the Dexterity Sphere, where you dodge and destroy a chrome sphere that attacks faster and faster while earning points. There's the Holo Trainer, where you battle a holographic image that actually shows you point values for each move so you know what's most effective. And then there's the Practice Sphere, which lets you practice fighting moves most effective at different ranges. I mean, name another fighting game from 1993 that had a training mode anywhere near that robust. Street Fighter II didn't have anything close. Now let's talk about something that doesn't get enough attention, the visual presentation of Eternal Champions. Because in 1993, fighting games were defined by their graphics as much as their gameplay, and Sega made a very deliberate choice here. Street Fighter II set the standard with its colorful, hand-drawn sprites, bright, expressive with that classic Capcom charm. Then Mortal Kombat came along and flipped the script entirely. Instead of hand-drawn characters, Midway used digitized footage of real actors. They filmed actual people in front of blue screens and turned those recordings into sprites. That gave Mortal Kombat its hyper-realistic, almost uncanny look. It was gritty, it was disturbing, and it felt kind of like you were watching something real. But that approach had limits. The animations sometimes looked stiff, and the characters had a slightly off, stop-motion quality to them. Then in 1994, Killer Instinct raised the bar again by using pre-rendered CGI graphics. Rare built the entire game using Silicon Graphics computers, rendering 3D models and converting them to 2D sprites. The backgrounds were pre-rendered movies that actually changed angles depending on where you were standing. It was technically impressive, no question about it, but those pre-rendered sprites also had a stiff feel and just looked kind of plasticky. Sure, they were impressive in screenshots, but could feel lifeless in motion. So where did Eternal Champions fit into all of this? Sega made a choice that was kind of brilliant in retrospect. They went all in on traditional hand-drawn animation, but with a twist. The characters are absolutely massive, taking up about 60% of the screen height. The sprites are incredibly detailed with so many frames of animation that even their idle poses are well animated. And the art style? It has that same kind of comic book aesthetic that Sega would later perfect in Comic Zone. If you look closely, you can see the influences everywhere. The character designs have that anime flair that Street Fighter popularized. But with the violence, the blood, and the overkills, that's straight out of Mortal Kombat's playbook. But the actual execution? That's the pure hand-drawn cartoon animation that was closer to what Comic Zone would later do in its comic book panels and large characters that are fluid and full of personality in a way that digitized actors and pre-rendered models just couldn't match. So here's the thing. That choice gave Sega's team something that neither Mortal Kombat nor Killer Instinct could offer. Expressive, exaggerated animation that could convey emotion and personality. Think about it. When Shadow taunts her opponent, "Coward," you can see the contempt in her posture. When Slash swings his club, there's a weight and impact behind every frame. You don't quite get that with digitized actors or pre-rendered models. You get realistic movement that impresses technically but doesn't connect emotionally. Now, the background artwork is just as detailed, with incredible variety across the different time periods. The prehistoric age has dinosaurs roaming in the background. The industrial stage has giant fans and machinery. The carnival stage is just chaotic and full of colors. Every arena tells a story and reinforces the character's era. But were the graphics perfect? No. The Genesis had color limitations, and the game could look dark and pixelated in places, especially where dithering was used to create a kind of pseudo-transparency effect. The animation, while it was detailed, was a little choppy in some places compared to Capcom's work, but the ambition was undeniable. Sega's artists created something that felt like a living comic book, blending the best elements of Street Fighter's expressive characters, Mortal Kombat's brutal violence, and the hand-drawn aesthetic that Comic Zone would later perfect. And that's the win. Eternal Champions didn't try to out-realistic Mortal Kombat or out-tech Killer Instinct, it went in a completely different direction. And in a market full of imitators, that was a bold move, and honestly, it paid off. The game sold over 1.6 million copies on the Genesis. That's nearly as many as Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat 2 in the same period. People noticed, and even looking back on it today, there's something about Eternal Champions' hand-drawn visuals that keeps pulling me back in. And look, if you know me, you know I'm a sucker for good pixel art, and this game, my friends, has some of the very best. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room. Mortal Kombat had fatalities, and every MK clone wanted their own version. Eternal Champions has overkills, and seriously, some of them were way more creative than anything Midway was doing at the time. Here's how they worked. You had to knock your opponent into a specific spot on the stage, and then the background itself would kill them. In the prehistoric stage, a Tyrannosaurus Rex would eat your opponent whole. In the industrial stage, they get shredded apart by giant fans. What made overkills different from fatalities was that they required precise positioning. You had to learn where to stand and when to execute the throw. It added a layer of strategy that Mortal Kombat's button-mashing fatalities completely lacked. And in the Sega CD version of this game, it took it even further with new finishing moves called sudden deaths that could be activated when your opponent still had some life left, which I thought was a pretty cool addition. So here are some of my favorites. But now back to the Sega CD version. This is where Eternal Champions really showed what it could have been. Eternal Champions, Challenge from the Dark Side, came out a couple of years after the original in 1995, right at the end of the Sega CD's life. Most people never even knew it existed. This expanded version added 13 new playable characters to the original 9 from the cartridge version, bringing the total to 24. New game modes include tournament options like Roundabout, where 2 players start with 9 fighters in their rosters each, and battle until one side runs out. Like it or not, it also featured full motion video cutscenes that were meant to enhance the experience. But here's the tragic part. Sega of Japan saw Eternal Champions as competition for Virtua Fighter. They actively worked against the franchise. A Saturn sequel called The Final Chapter was planned, but got cancelled after only 20 pages of concept art. That series was forcibly killed off because of internal politics. I mean, just imagine what could have been if Eternal Champions had been released on the Saturn. Good one, Sega. So why didn't Eternal Champions become the next Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat? Well, as you can see, the game is kinda slow. Attacks didn't chain together that smoothly. The timing for combos was pretty tight, and the CPU could read your inputs and react instantly, which made single-player mode sometimes feel unfair. And that controller issue was a genuine problem. Requiring a 6-button controller for the best experience meant most players never got to experience the game properly. And the character designs, while creative, sort of felt like they were designed by a committee. Just go down the list. A cyborg cop, check. A vampire biker, check. A fishman who knows capoeira for some reason. It was all a bit much. But here's the thing. The game had depth, real depth. Players who took the time to learn its systems discovered something special. The defense-first type of gameplay. The resource management of the inner strength meter. The overkills. These features demanded a different kind of thinking, and I really enjoyed the learning curve here when playing it more than 3 decades ago when it first came out. And its manual is really great and helps flesh things out even more, with its detailed breakdowns of each character's fighting style. Blade uses Kempo, Shadow uses Ninjutsu and Taijutsu, Jetta uses Savat and Penchachalat, Trident uses Capoeira. The developers put some serious research into martial arts styles, and it shows. Each character's move list reflects their specific discipline. That's the kind of detail that fighting game nerds like us appreciate. And that's the real tragedy of Eternal Champions. Not that it was a bad game, but that it never got the chance to evolve. The ideas were there. The ambition was there. a homegrown American fighting game that tried to do something different in a genre dominated by Japanese arcade ports. Shadow Yamoto, the female ninja assassin, became the most popular character. She even got her own spin-off game called Experts. There was merchandising, there was a fan base, and then Sega of Japan just pulled the plug because they wanted to push Virtua Fighter instead. And yeah, we're lucky that Virtua Fighter went on to change fighting games forever with its impressive 3D polygon graphics. But for a company with the size and capabilities of Sega to pick just one is really disappointing. I mean, come on. I'm sure Sega could have done both and aimed them at different types of gamers. Anyway, the game's creator, Michael Latham, said in an interview that he looked back at the design and felt proud that it still stands the test of time, and you know what? He's right. The game has some flaws, but it was also ambitious in ways that most fighting games of its era never even tried. So, if you see an Eternal Champions cartridge sitting there in a retro game shop or in your buddy's game room, maybe give it another shot. Not because it's better than Street Fighter II, because it's not. And not because it's more brutal than Mortal Kombat, because it isn't. But because it's something different. A game that tried to do its own thing in a genre full of imitators. A game that put story first when no one else did. A game with 17 different battle room projectiles and a training mode that let you practice against bouncing spears and holographic trainers. A game that asked you to think instead of just mash buttons. And a game that dared to look different. Yeah, that was a gamble, and it didn't always pay off, but it gave us something unique that still stands out from the crowd today. And if that's not worth defending, then I don't know what is. Alright my friends, this is the Retro Gaming Boss signing out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.